Okay, good afternoon. So it is 12:03, November 13th. Today, we have the curious case of There's No Place Like Home. And just some background on it for those that are kind of new here or coming in from the outside. We're actually opening this one up to the public. It's not going to be the members only detective club. The comments will still be, I think, for the members only, but we thought we'd open it up today. Typically, what we'll do is we look at a case, a historical case, and we'll talk about it. What are the implications of the case itself? But what I like to do is part of Think Like a Detective. I'm a private investigator now in the civilian side, and we teach. I'm also a licensed instructor, but we teach private investigation techniques that you can use and apply to history. So it's an evidence-based approach, and that's kind of what we share here. Some of those tips. This is a fascinating case, and it actually ties in a lot of things. This was a talk that I gave to some local Chamber of Commerce groups in Pacific Northwest. And it was fascinating because it ties in a lot of themes and a lot of ideas that people think are new or recent, but actually they've been permeating throughout the American consciousness for quite some time. And to give you a background of myself and why this case was kind of interesting and how it even got started was before I became a private investigator, I investigated terrorist bombings. So first in U.S. military, the Army, EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, we did kind of the forensics, post-blast side of it. Okay, that's okay, how a bomb is made. Later on, I moved in to Thailand, Southeast Asia, and was looking at the very large insurgency there. And tremendous amount of bombs in southern Thailand, a lot. And so 2,700, I believe, in 2007, actually, in Yala, Narathiwat, Patani, 3 southern provinces. It's a jungle. It was nuts. And that kind of spurred me on to go, I could understand in Iraq and Afghanistan why people would want to bomb us. I mean, we had soldiers killing soldiers, Marines trying to kill other Marines. I mean, literally there was fratricide in some cases, because just operational tempo. It's a war, it's an invasion. I could understand a lot of the violence that was going on. It made logical sense. But in Thailand, you kind of were taken aback. In other words, this was a peaceful nation that suddenly this violence kind of raised itself up. And from my perspective, who wants to hurt a Thai? I mean, they're great. I could see why sometimes people want to hurt other people. You kind of get that sometimes, but in Thailand, it set me aback. So I wanted to see what gets into the mind of the bomber, right? In other words, what radicalizes someone? What takes a person from being a neighbor to somebody to over a period of radicalization? What is that process that gets them to the point that they want to now kill somebody, right? Especially with a bomb. That's a lot of investment. That's not just an emotional reaction like a knife or a gun. You have to invest time, energy, and commitment to make a bomb and do it, and that sort of thing. So that was my background. I researched bombings. And the bombing that we're going to talk about today was one of those that I would actually teach in the Homeland Security regions back in America. So I'd come back to America and I'd show the Thailand bombings, but I would also show a lot of the American history bombings to kind of illustrate the technical aspect of it for a lot of the first responders back here in the U.S. And this bombing was one of them. So that's why we're going to kind of talk about it. But what comes from this bombing when we start to look at what's called the link analysis for the OSINT investigators out there, looking at history and seeing, okay, how is that connected? And where do these ideas come from that then kind of interject or evolve or synthesize and fuse within kind of that general consciousness that makes then violence either more probable or less probable, right? It's turning up the heat or turning down the heat. And where do all these things lead? So the case of There's No Place Like Home encapsulates a lot of the things that I find fascinating. And it really illustrates, I think, a good deal about kind of the evolution of the American psyche, where we are today, even though this happened well over 100 years ago, in some cases 120 years ago. And so that's why we look at it. And so what we'll learn today is some of the techniques, but we're also going to find what is the connection between, at the time, the largest terrorist bombing in America, an assassination of a president, and nudists. It's no good. Trust me, it will all make sense here shortly. And so hopefully have a good time. If you do have a question, go ahead and put it in the comments. I can't see it up on the stream service because of Substack. Won't talk to the streaming service I use. So just put it in the comments there on Substack, and then I'll get to them as best I can try to see them. Again, I'm a one-man show today, so I apologize for this. I'm an investigator, not a streamer. So what occurred was in October of 1910, shortly after midnight, a large explosion occurred in Los Angeles, and it was at the Los Angeles Times building. it was a massive explosion, in part because of the dynamite, in part because of the bomber had placed this package of dynamite, the satchel of dynamite, between walls, and of course it's brick walls. The gas mains that used to run throughout all of the old buildings, that's an enhancer, right? So the dynamite, the explosive, hit the gas mains, further creating secondary explosions, collapsing the building. And then because it was a newspaper printing office, a very large one, the paper, the pulp, and the chemicals that were used in the ink and the finishing, those are extremely flammable. So this was just absolutely a horrifying event that occurred. The smoldering of the ruins lasted for 2 days. They were pulling people out for 2 days. I believe the end casualty was like something like 31 people that occurred during that time. And it shocked the nations. It just literally shocked the entire nation in there, right? So these are little boards I use for when I present. But it was absolutely horrifying. And the news went out. This was the 9/11. So think of that in terms of this. This was the night, for those that are old enough to remember 9/11. I keep forgetting there are people in the military now that were born after 9/11. But this was absolutely horrifying. And it shocked the nation. It went out that this had occurred, that, Los Angeles Times building had blown up. And the investigation then begins. Once even before the ruins are finished, they begin the investigation. Now, keep in mind, this is 1910. There is no FBI. There is no National Investigation Service aside from the postal inspectors if it's a postal crime. And the Secret Service tends to act on behalf of the Treasury Department, looking up things like counterfeiting mostly. And even then, the Secret Service is kind of in its nascency, and a lot of things are still filled by private investigation, private detective firms. For example, when the Civil War broke out, and then before, the intelligence that the United States was getting on the northern side for the southern side, that was done by private investigation firms, specifically Pinkerton's, the Pinkerton group, which was formed in 1850, the first American private detective firm. They were in charge of doing Secret Service jobs, and then Army intelligence jobs, kind of J2, G2, what we're looking at now. So that a lot of the things that the government did was filled in by private entities, like private investigators. And in this case, there's no national investigation unit. Why did they think they needed a national investigation unit? Well, prior to this bombing, this was huge. There had been a series of 10 to 12 other bombings of targets that were using dynamite. None this big, none with this huge casualty producing event. But nevertheless, it was believed initially that this was part of that kind of a longer, get my microphone over here, kind of a longer trend in bombing that was going on. And so what they decided to do is they hired the Burns Detective Agency, because he had been investigating the other spate of bombings that was going throughout the United States. Now, this spate of bombing wasn't new. The violence that was going on had been going on beforehand. But again, this kind of shattered that illusion. There were two other clues to what might be motivating. What was the motive, right? We have the means, we have motive, we have opportunity. Well, what was the motive, right? We need to get that. And there's some clues that may direct the motive so they can try to find the suspects and go after those persons responsible. The editor of the paper was a retired Union general, and he was in Los Angeles, and his home, actually, there was a parcel at his home with the timer and dynamite. Luckily, it was discovered before it went off. And then at the assistant editor or the lawyer for the paper, like, another device was found. Luckily, a servant, actually, one of the butlers there, found it at the house, threw it out, or a sheriff came over, saw it, threw it out in the yard, and then it blew up. So both of those had components similar to what they were able to recover from the Los Angeles Times building. And you had two people connected to the Los Angeles Times, the owner, co-owner, lawyer, also having these targeted ones against them. So the suspect list kind of begins to focus, right? This seems to be something with that. What was going on in Los Angeles at the time? What was the motive behind it? May have been, at that time, they're thinking, this is the investigators from Burns Detective Agency looking at it, because they were hired by both the editor of the paper, paid for him, and the city of Los Angeles paid for the Burns Detective Agency, because he ended up working for them. But again, he's a private investigator. And there was a string of unions. So San Francisco had kind of voted that it was going to be an open shop. It was a union, or it was kind of a union town, right? You could collectivize and you could become a union there. Los Angeles businesses were actually rallying together to not do that. So it was believed that this had to do something with the labor issues that were going on, because the Los Angeles Times had been very outspoken against, organizing in a union and organizing in a labor movement in Los Angeles. They were going to keep Los Angeles union free. And so it was kind of believed to be that. Now, the hunt was on, and the Burns Detective Agency very quickly was doing some of the things that were very normal back then in an investigative process. They looked all throughout the hotels. In fact, there used to be hotel detectives, like private investigators that just hung out in hotels and protected property and, kept tabs of who comes in there and all that sort of thing to help out the local police. But the one of the hotel owners, one of the actually it was more of a boarding house owner, noted that there were two people that she had overheard them talking about doing this nefarious thing. And so she came forward and became a witness. She gave a really good description of the people that were there, and there was about 5 people there. And so she said, so now we have conspiracy. We have more people involved in this thing, and where they were. They also found where they had purchased the dynamite, and they talked to the clerk and the owner of the dynamite shop. And it was interesting because the owner of the dynamite shop had said that he received initially the request, and it didn't make any sense because dynamite in those days, it's a nitroglycerin mixed in. Now it's nitrocellulose. It's a little more stable. But anyway, back then you would measure your dynamite by in the percentage of kind of nitroglycerin to the dynamite. And typically you could do everything you needed with, 40 to 60%. But this person that was now ordering this very large amount of dynamite said they wanted 90% pure, which is, if you're working with dynamite back then, it's like, doesn't make any sense. So he actually wanted the guy to come in. He's like, you should probably come in to make that order. I can't take it, by postal service here. So one of the eventual bombers actually came in and ordered it. And he said, look, let me talk you down to about 70. He says, I really need to make sure. He said, what are you using it for? He says, I'm just blowing up stumps in the yard. It says you can get by with 40. And he kept insisting on the higher percentage. So that was suspicious. So that stood out in the mind of the clerk that eventually did sell him the dynamite, but it was at a lower percentage. I think it was like 70% or something, 65, 70%. He guaranteed it would take care of any of the hardest stumps that you've got. But they wanted to take down a building, right? They're looking at something different. So they had more information and more clues. And this eventually went interstate. They were in New Mexico, Nevada, and the investigation led to New York. It led over to England, to London, England. And then it came back home to America, to a very interesting place. And this is where we call it the case of there's no place like home. There's a small town that you can only get to by boat, by ferry. There was a service that would go out from Tacoma that would take you to the town of Home, Washington, which was a town of about 200 families, roughly at its high water mark, that was built out in Washington State. And it was in the they call it the James Bay now. If you go to Gig Harbor, just around the Sound, even today, it's very remote, very hard to get to. You have to take a remote road to go out there. And the population really hasn't changed that much since 1910. But the Burns Detective Agency set up a headquarters in Tacoma, and then they began to send agents into Home to try to investigate that area for these bombers. Now, why? Why in the world? I mean, here you are in London, England, and suddenly you turn around to come back and look at this tiny little village that was set up in Home, Washington in 1910. Again, about 200 families. You can only get there by boat, once or twice a day, depending on the fleet that works back. And the boats aren't big, so it's not like a large ferry. Yeah, I couldn't load these in there, right? So you're just looking at these little call them a mosquito fleet here in the Puget Sound area, right? Oops, there you go. So it's a tiny little area, it's a little thing. So why in the world is National Investigations going here? Well, to get the answer to that, we have to kind of go back 10 years, and it was at the Pan American expedition in Buffalo, New York, when a shot rang out, and President McKinley was hit with 238 caliber bullets at close range from an assassin, right? Leon Klogzold, it's a hard name to pronounce, who was born in Michigan, but to immigrant parents, and had become radicalized to the anarchist movement. And so he had shot President McKinley. And that shocked America, right? So this is 1901. President McKinley was shot by the anarchist, or self-proclaimed anarchist. So he was very open about it. He said he'd become radicalized by the assassination, well, first by the labor movement within the United States and the situation that was going on in the 1890s. He had been out of work, and at that process of being out of work had become radicalized. And then he was inspired, he says, by the assassination of King Umberto I of Italy by an anarchist. And so he thought that anarchist and socialist was the way forward, and he chose McKinley as a symbol. Why? Well, because McKinley was kind of one of the first presidents that really began the overt imperialist of America outside of the borders of America, of the continental borders of America. Under McKinley, we began to, in earnest, move forward toward the Panama Canal. It could have been either Nicaragua or Panama. We were moving forward to the purchase of probably the French concession that was moving through Congress, and or Nicaragua, we're going to build it on our own. We also were in the Spanish-American War. So when the Maine blew up, we assigned that blame to the Spanish. Now, subsequent investigations have shown, an explosion versus an implosion. So in other words, it was the boiler probably blowing out versus a mine that would blow the hull in. But nevertheless, routes and resources. We went to war against Spain, and in short order, we got Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. So we got a lot more territory than normal. The Philippines had actually proven a harder territory to swallow because the Filipino insurrection, or we called it an insurrection, but the Filipinos called it independence. After we had beaten Spain, the Filipinos began going, well, we need a country now. And then America said, no, it's ours. And so there was actually a guerrilla warfare beginning in the Philippines, which would last from this time of the assassination, probably almost 10 more years of real violence, the hard violence until about 5 more years. But it was America's first Vietnam, really. Because of the negative press that was coming in, because of that sudden self-reflection. We're supposed to be anti-colonial, but yet what are we doing in the Philippines? And that created a huge dichotomy in America. All of that was under McKinley's watch, the beginning of that. And so he was chosen as a symbol by Leon Xolzold to shoot. And so he said he's going to go there. There was a reception line, and he simply walked forward and shot McKinley. Now, he was tried, executed very quickly, and then Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was then signed in as a president. And that's why we have President Theodore Roosevelt, who's now on Mount Rushmore, because of an anarchist that, identified that he needed a symbol to, make his political paradigm fit. But why home Washington? How does this have to do with anything? Well, he was a self-proclaimed anarchist. And what happened was the fallout from that shooting reverberated throughout America. What was anarchism? How was America even involved in anarchism? That's a European thing, right? Socialism and anarchism, that's over there in Europe. That doesn't make any sense over here. Why would that even occur? And so that created a tremendous shockwave throughout the United States. So again, kind of if you're thinking of 9/11, think of the kind of the backlash, or the mechanism that we had against radical Islam after that point, right? It was very severe. The same occurred with the anarchist movement here. There was a number of anarchist laws at both the federal and the state law for anti-anarchists. And we'll go into that here. So you can see some of that. Hopefully that shows up there. But one of them, and the anarchist actually, this is an interesting one. I'll show you in a minute how to go through some of these old papers, which are gold mines of information. Now, keep in mind, they may or may not be accurate. You have to validate everything. But looking at the context and what was being talked about at the time and the framework of it, the contextualization of the history is absolutely fascinating. But if you look here, you're going to see, actually it's over here. I'm on the wrong part of the screen, but that's okay. There we go. So if you look here, you're going to see that the anarchists actually celebrated, or at least the press was portraying that as celebration of McKinley's assassination. And the Socialist Party in Chicago said, we're not going to do a resolution condemning or mourning the loss of McKinley. So as you can imagine, that set fire up, because McKinley was a very well-beloved president. Even though he was a Republican, he was very cross the party lines. He was actually very, very beloved for what he did on the whole by the American people. He was the first president during his first election cycle. He didn't have Teddy Roosevelt in the ticket then, but on his first election cycle, 1896, I believe, he was the first president to break the popular vote, right? He had the majority of the popular vote, right? Before it was always right there, and it was the delegates that kind of decided, right? However, in this case, he won it, landslide. It was against William Jennings Bryan. The main issue was, of course, the gold standard, but there were other issues that involved there. The second election in 1900, then he pulled Teddy Roosevelt on the ticket. Again, William Jennings Bryan was on the Democrat side, and he won even bigger, right? It was a landslide, even more than the first, which was a big kind of a validation for his first term. So he was very well beloved. This, like I said, sent absolute shockwaves. It was more impactful across a broader demographic than the killing of JFK, right? So let that one set in there for a little bit. And it was absolutely shocking because The JFK one was contextualized in communism, which we had a long-term fight against. So that sort of made sense. This was like a lightning bolt out of the blue. This just didn't make any sense. Much like, was it 20 years before when Garfield had been shot, and Chester A. Arthur, his vice president, then became president. That was by a mentally disturbed man. But that was basically that, these were shocking, right? And Abraham Lincoln's assassination, that was seen as, okay, that's the last battle of the Civil War, or a last shot of the Civil War, was seen in that context. But this one, America was modernizing. We were becoming civilized. This was the golden age of America. And so it was quite shocking to many people on many levels, despite the Spanish-American War and the effects in the Philippines. It was still very, very shocking. And then so he was very beloved. So when anarchists and socialists make statements like this, or evidence of statements like this comes out and is publicized, it sets a huge backlash against the anarchists and the socialists. So laws are passed, and in Tacoma, Washington, a group of Union veterans. There was the Grand Old Party, the Grand Old Army of the Republic. So the Union veterans in Tacoma had a huge rally because McKinley had been a Civil War veteran, and he was kind of seen as the last Civil War veteran that would be president. It was assumed. So that was very meaningful for the guys that had fought the Civil War. And they rallied in Tacoma, and they were going to get on a boat, and they were going to go to home Washington, and they were going to burn it to the ground. Why? Again, why? Right? This is this election. So 10 years later, we got Burns Detective Agency setting up in Tacoma, Washington, sending agents to home Washington looking for the perpetrators of a bombing of the Los Angeles Times. 10 years before that, 1901, now we have the Union veterans in Tacoma doing pretty much the same thing, but they're not going to go investigate. They're going to burn home to the ground. So why? What was it about home Washington that for two separate decades, a massive kind of a national incident focuses on this town of about 200 people in the middle of nowhere on a bay in Washington state? Well, to get the answer to that, we got to go back another 10 years. This is where it kind of connects in here, and it's fascinating. So when you go back about 10 years, home Washington was actually founded by 3 members who had left what's called a Bellamy socialist colony, a Bellamy state. And the Bellamy colonies were fascinating because people don't realize, people think of socialism, communism, and all that as something foreign, right? Again, the anarchist movement was seen as something in Europe. It's not here. And people think, well, it was Marx and Engels, that's something foreign. And until the Russian Revolution, that didn't come here. That's kind of the popular thoughts today, right? The conventional wisdom, as we like to call it. But it's not true. There was a tremendous amount of socialist movement within the United States, homegrown socialist theory that was permeating throughout. But it had removed the class battle. There was no longer to be a class warfare that then destroyed everything so it could be built up again. This socialist revolution was kind of smiley face socialism. It was kind of utopian. It had a very Christian basis to it, and it was very popular. And there were a number of utopias that were set up in America. And America had a long history of utopias, not necessarily socialist, but even religious. For example, the Mormons were setting up, Latter-day Saints, were setting up their own kind of utopia and looking for that as they traveled through Missouri, Independence, Missouri, I think, and then down to Salt Lake City. They were looking for that. And a branch of those actually ended up here in Washington State, where a guy that broke away from the Latter-day Saints believed that his children were God. And in fact, in a Trinity, I think. So he had believed that to be true. He moved up to Walla Walla, Washington, and he actually had about 2 to 3. He had about, I think at one point he had about 2,000 followers with him. And because they believed that his son was the resurrection or the new coming of Jesus Christ. And when his son got tuberculosis and died, that kind of put a failure on that. He left to Canada, it dissolved. So there were lots of these little things. There are many other groups that actually popped up within Washington State. But among them that began to transition. So there was this kind of religious utopia, but about the 1880s and 90s, you began to see a new trend of a socialist utopias being set up and socialist colonies being set up in America. And that's where here in 1890, we have, there's 3 godfathers of American socialism, but one of them, his name was Edward Bellamy. And this is an original book from 1890 of Edward Bellamy. And it's a book, it says Looking Backwards, 2000 to 1887, right? So he wrote it, this is published in 1890. I think 1888 was the original publishing. But it goes into, basically it's a fictional book, but it talks about how you can get to a utopia, right? So in other words, let me change this view here. There we go. So it talks about how you can change to a new utopia within America using socialist principles, but he always said it's a voluntary socialist principle. Now, lest you think that's just a guy writing a fictional book, self-help socialist book back in the day. Later on, and in fact, if you go in the Historical Detective Agency, we talk about, I think about 2 months ago, the Edward Mendell House, who was the handler, the fixer for President Woodrow Wilson later in 1911, 1912, up into 1920, 1919, the League of Nations, World War One, the massive kind of cultural genocide against America that he did, the resurrection of the Klan, resegregation, that guy, right? That Woodrow Wilson. House had written a book called A Story of Tomorrow, right? And it was about Philip Drew. He called it Philip Drew, Administrator, Story of Tomorrow. Again, a fictionalized account, but he uses much of the same language that is in Edward Bellamy's book, Looking Backward. Now, what is this book about? Let me see if I can get this thing going here. The book is about, it talks very much about, let's do extra camera. All right, it's not going to do it. Okay, well, we'll just do it this way. So what Bellamy talks about here is in his Looking Backwards, he falls asleep, his character falls asleep in 1887, and then because of hypnosis, he sleeps until 2000. So he wakes up in 2000 and he's learning about the past and everything. But what you have it here is you actually have things like socialized medicine. You have credit cards being paid for everything, right? So in other words, in a cash society, when this was published 1890, there's credit cards. He has socialized medicine. You're assigned a job. You're assigned everything is under the government, the state, everything within the state, nothing outside the state. So it's fascism in that way, in that it believes in everything as one whole, but it's economic distributionism, and it's kind of control of economics and redistribution is more of the socialist communist kind of line, but it's done without violence. And that is the key distinguisher of American socialism versus European socialism. So European socialism, because they had such a high and long class structure that maintained itself for so long, they wanted to burn it down. It was more of the violence, especially the French version that got exported up to Russia. And then, of course, the British, like to promote that because they need to keep the continent kind of in shambles. But in America, we didn't quite have that. There was still the promise of something better in America. So burning everything down didn't appeal quite to the masses as much as it did, except in certain cases like labor, when there was definitely, some economic hits that were being taken. So what he talks about in here is that kind of utopian vision that he could do, and it's by degrees, right? In other words, it occurs over a period of about 110 years, right? 112 years, so 113 years. So 113 years to get to that, and it's by slow phases, and that's what he talks about here is this gradual movement toward this socialist utopia. And this thing went gangbusters. This was a bestseller in the United States. They actually started Bellamy they call it Bellamy nationalism. And they set up, I think it was in 32 states, basically turnkey franchises of Bellamy socialist clubs that were designed to try to work towards legislation and setting up these separate colonies to make this happen. So without creating a political party, a socialist political party, Bellamy nationalists were working on both sides of the aisle to be able to implement various mechanisms to get to the end result of a socialist utopia within the United States. And some of them said, well, we don't want this political process. We're going to make our own little colony, and then everybody will see how well it works, and then they're going to come in on it. And just south of Tacoma, between Tacoma and Puyallup, I think about 27 miles south of Tacoma, they've created a Bellamy socialist colony in the United States here in Washington State. It didn't do so well, right? Because eventually, half the people, no matter what he says, eventually people will figure out, well, I don't have to do a lot of work and I get the benefits, so I'm not going to do the work. And then the productivity goes way down, no matter how much you try to inspire them. That's always the key, and that's what Edward Mendell House, Woodrow Wilson's handler, talked about in his book 20 years later, is you have to motivate the people. You have to create this internal motivation so that basically they sell themselves into slavery, but it's a nice smiley face slavery. How you do that, the American version of socialism. So that's what Bellamy was. So this colony failed. And 3 of the members of the Bellamy colony, they said, well, you know what? This would have worked, but there's just too many dang rules. So let's go start our own colony. So they get a boat, they go around Puget Sound, they find this little area, they buy the land. So now they have money. They buy a bunch of land, and they create the town of Home, Washington. Now, remember, they weren't socialists because they said the socialists had too many rules. This was the first and the only colony in America that was an anarchist colony. There are no rules. There's only one rule. You're not going to own the land. The land is owned by the home colony, the home association. And they went to Tacoma. There's a lawyer in Tacoma that actually did the plat maps and everything, did it. The Home Washington Association owns the land. You could come in and build whatever you wanted on your land. You could do whatever you wanted on the land. It's easy. It's yours, the house. But when that land, though, belongs to the home association and everybody collectively will help each other do things. There's no sheriff. They did get a post office, but then they lost it because they kept doing things. And it's just live and let live and do what you want to do. And so around 1882, that's when Home Washington came up. And that's when Home Washington was formed. And it's just this little, it's this little tiny town that, there we go. It's this little tiny town, like I said, Coos Bay there, or Joe's Bay, I'm sorry, in Joe's Bay. And that's it. Like I said, you have to take a boat to get there, but they would build it. So there was one lady that lived in a teepee. She built a giant kind of a wigwam. She lived in that. Two guys lived like trolls. There was a giant tree stump. They hollowed it out. They went down, they put a picket fence around it, and that was their home. So there was basically no rules. The other thing is when you look at the Washington State regulations at the time, you couldn't get a haircut on Sunday. You couldn't buy an alcohol on Sunday. There were so many rules. And so going out here was really, for most of them, they're just going to flaunt the rules. That's what they were doing. But they were an anarchist colony. And oh, by the way, on one of those articles, Emma Goldman, who you see here, very famous socialist anarchist, America's communist, she visited home many times because they said they were anarchist, right? No rules, anarchist, socialist. And so that attracted not just the people that are like, I'm tired of the rules, but it attracted people like actual anarchists, like European style anarchists that want to overthrow the government. So those worlds kind of collided. The just leave me the heck alone collided with, we want to destroy the government, so there's no rules for anybody. And those kind of blended there in home. So she did visit home, but in her own words, she said home is where socialism goes to die, right? Because people are more interested in chicken recipes and than anything else. So, but she did visit there, and there were people that would go in and out of home, and it was famous because half of the people were literally suing the other half to keep their clothes on, while that half was suing the other half to take their clothes off. Home Washington, most famous before any of the assassination and the bombing, was famous because the town said, well, if there's no rules, I don't have to wear clothes. And so that became a contentious issue. Of course, like in today, that grabs the headlines, especially in Tacoma and Seattle and nationally. So Home Washington was famous because it was an anarchist free love colony with no rules, and people are taking their clothes off was the rumors that went around. And there was a group there that did promote that. There were hardcore anarchist socialists of the revolutionary kind that did go there, a few of them, and one of them created a paper. It was called The Demonstrator, then it was The Agitator, and those papers are fascinating to read through. Basically, it was him moving that through. It was reprinted in Paris, France, and San Francisco. So Home Washington, with about 200 people, so this tiny little hamlet, was actually putting out, before the internet, it was putting out information of socialist revolution theory that was going over into Paris and France and being read in parlors there. So that little paper in Home Washington was quite impactful, even before the internet. But again, it didn't represent the entire community that was there. Most of them were just there because they didn't like a lot of rules outside. But there was that subcontext. Emma Goldman did go there. And going forward, we're going to see that one of the bombers that actually did go into Home Washington for a period of time. And that's where our story will continue. But understand that this development, this kind of violence, this kind of fermentation of ideas that still exists today, that is a lot of that's homegrown. It didn't come always from outside. There was a lot of internal building and developing of that theory prior to importing various ideals from externally. In fact, if it had just been an external thought, it may not have taken hold as much as it did within current society today. It may have been, oh, that's a foreign, we're not going to do that, right? We're not going to look at that. So that's one thing we're looking at. So we've gone back 1901. So what happened in 1901 when the Union veterans were going to go burn down home? Interestingly, there was one of the home residents was a Confederate veteran, a cavalry veteran who was a colonel. Now, there's two stories to this, both equally plausible. Which one is true, I don't know, so I'll tell both. They're similar enough that it may be a little bit of both. So the cavalry colonel said, I'm going to go, the boat captain, the ferry boat captain came over, warned Home Washington, said, hey, there's a mob in Tacoma, and they're trying to conveyance to come over here and burn this place down. So Home Washington's like, what do we do? We're just hanging out here. So the Confederate colonel that had retired out in Home, he says, let me handle this. So he gets on the boat. He goes over to the pier where that Union veterans are now massing to go burn down Home Washington. He hops off the boat. He confronts them. He goes right up to them and goes, hey, guys, trust me. I know rebellion. I fought you guys. I know what a rebellion looks like, or revolutionaries look like. That ain't it, right? And he tried to describe Home, and he's telling them, pretty much what it's all about. And they said, okay. And then he actually talked the people down. Right. So that kind of reduced the tensions, and then they dissipated from there. So Home Washington still existed after 1901. Obviously, otherwise Burns' detective wouldn't be doing that, or we wouldn't be talking about it today. The other version of that is that they tried to get the boat, and that the ship captain refused them because he knew the people at Home. And he says, yeah, I know the people at Home. They're not crazy. Well, they are crazy, but they're not revolutionary, and that sort of thing. So that one of those two things was how Holmes survived to live another day, to now be investigated by Burns Detective Agency, now that we're back in 1910. So he sets it up. He begins to send people into Home Washington. And one of the things during the Burns Detective Agency, as they're looking up the Los Angeles bombing, they're trying to get in there. There's a lot of other things going on anarchy-wise within the world. In fact, the newspapers, when you read about the Los Angeles Times bombing, and now they're looking at seeing this as kind of, it tends to be labor, but they're also saying it's potentially anarchist bombing. There is a massive firefight in London, England, that was in the papers at the same time as we're looking through this. And it talked about how Winston Churchill, a young Winston Churchill, was actually kind of leading the Met Police and the Royal Navy to, besiege the anarchists, which had besieged a police station. So, I mean, there's literally kind of street battles that we've forgotten about for whatever reason going on in London between anarchists in the city and the city of London, which with Winston Churchill kind of leading it, that are occurring at this time. So in the consciousness of Americans, this is a very violent, a very dangerous movement that's going on. And then we don't really separate, right? Anarchist, if you don't believe in rules, there it is. And it caused, back in the McKinley assassination, it caused a lot of laws up until 1903 and 1904, defining anarchism as, okay, it's overthrowing the government, or believing that the government doesn't need to be there. Organized government doesn't need to exist. That makes you an anarchist. That means you're an outlaw. And that built upon, later on when Wilson came in, the sedition laws, the anti-sedition laws, and that sort of thing. He built upon that later on. But going back to the investigation, we begin to see that they start looking into Home Washington. They begin to examine that, and a witness comes forward, or a person who's going to turn state's witness. His name is Donald Vogel, and he was the son. He grew up in Home Washington. Now, if you grow up in a town that says we don't like rules, we're going to be against everything, we're kind of counterculture, well, you're going to be pro-culture, right? If, in other words, when you hit that teenage years and you kind of rebel against your parents, if they're saying no rules, well, you're going to go rules, right? You're going to go the opposite spectrum sometimes if you're a rebellious kind of kid. Well, that apparently was Donald Vogel, who's raised by a single mom. A lot of single moms ended up going out to Home because, again, they weren't judged. In those days, it was, it was looked at somewhat askance. But he went there. His single mom raised him, and he, depending on which story you listen to, he did end up being a witness for Burns Detective Agency. And he said, hey, I know one of the bombers. I know one of the guys that ended up linking up with them. His name is David Kaplan. He did live in Home with his family. He sent his family back down to San Francisco, and then he's going to go out and do it, right? And so, yeah, Emma Goldman's there. He knows Emma Goldman. He's been talking to her, all of this stuff, right? And so Burns Detective Agency says, what can, okay, so how can you help us? So Donald Vogel volunteers because he's an insider. He's going to go through that network, and it is a phenomenal network of socialists and anarchists throughout the United States. And what you'll hear is that even back in 1910, while this investigation is going on, one of the things that Burns Detective Agency found was that there is a tremendous network of people that will provide self-supporting information, finances, shelter, food, transportation within the United States that believe in socialism and anarchism, right? So it was a support network that was permeating everywhere from New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, over to Home Washington, and that sort of thing. So there were these, we kind of term them fellow travelers now, but back then it was a support network that was already in existence, including some lawyers that would provide defense work, which we'll find out here in a minute. And so the network was quite substantial at the time. So what ended up happening was Donald Voigel ended up going to New York to Emma Goldman's flat, locates one of the bombers. There's two left. Actually, the McNamara brothers were kind of the leaders of it, and they were two. They were the I believe it was the Iron and Bridge Builders Union president, and then his brother. So there was John and I think Jack McNamara, and they were the leaders of the bombing campaign. They were the guys that were starting that. And there were three others that were supporting them. And so David Kaplan is one of those supporters. They had arrested the McNamara brothers, and they were looking now at the secondary. And that was the one that was in Home Washington, was David Kaplan. That's how that linked all the way back over there. So David Kaplan now in the crosshairs, he's being hunted down. They go over there, they find his accomplice but his accomplice says, yeah, we hooked him up with a barber shop in Bainbridge Island, which is roughly about 50 miles north. If you drive it about, 20 miles north of Home Washington. It's a different area. It's a different island in Washington State in the Puget Sound system. But he's a barber over there, right? They set him up in that, and they've got him a cabin up there, and he's out of home right now. So the investigation now shifts, right? So, okay, we got a positive ID because the informant, the infiltrator. So he goes back in, and Burns Detective Agency now shifts up to Bainbridge Island. And there is a barber shop that was established there. So what happened was, and they're beginning to piece everything together. So David Kaplan had moved to home with his family. He did still maintain contacts. He'd been in San Francisco, and he had contacts with the socialist anarchist group. He moved up to Home Washington with his family, but he couldn't let go of that belief that he needs to do something more kinetic. So he sends his family down before bombing. He sends the family down to San Francisco. He goes down to meet the bombers, and he's in LA. They meet together. They procure the dynamite. The McNamaras go and they set the charges. So Kaplan wasn't one that set the charges, but he facilitated getting it in the assembly. Los Angeles Times blows up. He goes back up to Home Washington. His support network at home goes, hey, it's going to be too hot here, right? Remember what happened 9 years ago when Tacoma, Union veterans wanted to burn us down. You need to go somewhere, right, to protect the community that's, they're just here because they want to take their clothes off. So, go up to Bainbridge Island. They bought him a cabin and land in Bainbridge Island, way out in the woods. Think Kaczynski's cabin. And then in a place that's now Thunder Bay, they set him up with a barber shop, so he has a means of income. So he would come in the cabin. He lived way out in the woods in a cabin all by himself. He would come into town to this barber shop and cut hair. And he pretended that he was he was actually Russian, but he pretended he was Hungarian barber, right? So that covered his accent, right? So he learned barbershop in Hungary, and he's doing that. So he's there cutting hair. Now, if you go to Thunder Bay, it's a post office. So you can go there. There's a post office. That's where his barber stand used to be. And so they went there. Donald Voigel went there, and he went in the barber chair. And as David Kaplan, he didn't recognize him. So as David Kaplan was about to give him a shave and a haircut, he said, "Hey, you're David Kaplan." And David Kaplan froze. He's like, "What?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "You were over our house, right? You knew my mom. Emma was over there. Emma Goldman was over there. You knew my mom. And he's describing Home Washington. At that point, David Kaplan relaxes. He's like, "Oh, hey, welcome, great." And he invites him out to the cabin. He gets drunk. They're hanging out, and then he leaves, and he says, "Yeah, he tells the Burns Detective Agency, yeah, positive ID on him. That's him. I found his cabin. It's up here." So the sheriff's department with the Burns detectives goes out there, makes an arrest at the cabin, and then the trial. So the trial of the 5 bombers is interesting because Clarence Darrow, famous and later on Supreme Court justice, was the defender. So he was the defender for the bombers of this. And all of them eventually, they did receive prison sentences, but some were commuted, some served out their full prison sentences. None were executed, none was life, for killing about 30 innocent people in Los Angeles Times in a bombing. So the sentencing was extremely light for these bombers, and that was pretty much the story as it goes. But in that, you can see that, like I said, there's a lot of various history that occurs in that. So we find out that, the subtext, of course, is that there was socialist utopias in America. The anarchist colony, the one and only, is Home Washington. And the whole community isn't there. There's somewhat of a support network for more revolutionary groups that will move in. And that support network was tremendous, right? They were able to set people up in areas across the country with jobs, with houses, and that sort of thing. It was absolutely fascinating how that occurred. And the impact of small groups, they were able to kind of magnify their voice. So a small group here in Holme, Washington, was able to send the demonstrator and the agitator newspapers were, like I said, reprinted in parlors in Chicago and Paris and San Francisco. So absolutely fascinating. Now, what happened with the nudes versus the prudes? I know that's the main question everybody wants. Everybody's forget the socialists, forget the bombings, forget the assassination of the president. What happened to the nudists? Okay, well, here's what happened to the nudists. They went to court, continually went to court. They kept suing each other. Like I said, half the town was suing the other half to keep their clothes on. The other half was suing the other half to take their clothes off. So what happens is that it does go to court. The people that had to keep their clothes on keep their clothes on. But throughout that, they lost their post office because the articles espousing free love and it's okay to walk in your birthday suit, those were mailed. And we had the Comstock laws at the time, and the Comstock laws said you can't mail pornography. This was considered pornography. So the demonstrator, or there was the agitator, the demonstrator, it's one of those versions, same paper, same guy, just different name, was used, and it was mailed from the home post office. So they lost their post office and they had to walk over. That's why it has a different town name now in the post office, but they would have to walk to drop off their mail. They had lost it. So that lawsuit went out approximately, I think it was 1918 or 1919. So during World War I, the town began to sue each other again. The home association sued, the members were suing because they want to own the property. And they're like, look, we're not getting any services here. And thefts went up. So once the news kind of got out about home being free love and no rules and anything, that also attracts the criminal element, not just the revolutionary element, but now just the basic criminal element. So they came into town and they were robbing people and stealing from people. And it kind of destroyed that utopian vision that the three people that were the refugees from the Bellamy colonies, right? The Bellamy nationalists, socialists, back in the 1880s had tried to develop. And so it gradually descended because they weren't able to kind of maintain the cohesion that they wanted. Other elements would come in, the revolutionaries, the criminals. That occurred. And eventually in 1919, 1920, the court in Tacoma, Pierce County decided that, nope, we're going to, give the charter out, give the money back, people can own their property, and there it is. But if you go there now, you'll see this little grid pattern, and that's the original colony, because you were given 2.5 acres because they had scientifically determined you could exist off of 2.5 acres, and that's all you needed, and then, build your house. So that's pretty much what we can go to from there. Now, for the tradecraft, I like to show a little bit about that. The newspapers, absolutely key on this one. I did want to show you one thing on this one. On the book, like I said, this is 1890 original. A couple of things I like to do when I'm examining a book. Sometimes these are interesting. So this book actually is to someone. There's a writing in there from 1890, and it says, to Miss Maggie Gillum, with much care from her affectionate friend, and that it's just MSG. It's February 13th, 1890, right? So sometimes you can look those people up and you'll find, I have another different collection. I'll show it a different day. But there was actually a politician that was about 19, 20 years old that received a book from someone, and they later on became, I think it was a governor. So what they were reading, who was giving it to them, who was supporting in their social network, you can find out sometimes just the front piece of a book, postcards and things. What was the network that doesn't show up online, right? So always develop these, always capture these, and put these in your link analysis so that you've got those going forward. So that's interesting. The other one was, I was fascinated by the kind of the front piece, right? Who publishes a book is also very important. For example, the book, the Philip Drew Administrator, A Story of Tomorrow, that was written by Edward House, who was the handler, the fixer for Woodrow Wilson, and the guy that architected basically the League of Nations and all that other stuff. His book, the second printing, was actually done by a very large socialist paper. And they actually were communists. They actually would do communist pamphlets in America in the 1910s and 20s. And they gave the forward, the publisher gave a forward. House wrote anonymously at the time, but he knew who it was because in the forward he wrote about it. So the publisher themselves is very important about what book they're going to decide to publish. And you can tell a lot about the intent of the book and the author by who picks it up. So always look at the network and the relationship to see what is sometimes the goal or the intent, or how they feel like they want to use the information in a book to shape the public environment. But this was interesting to me. So in the front, like I said, this is 1890 original. But this later became the Houghton Mifflin Company. But at the time, it was the Riverside Press is what they went off of. But that little symbol in there was fascinating to me. So it had a motto in there. It says, if you If you can't do something perfect, just don't even do anything. But the symbology in there was interesting to me. It looked like Pan because it has the two flutes going out and he's by a river. And I'm going to share this with you because this is for the folks that like to use AI and think that AI has the answers. AI just continually, it's not there yet, may never get there. I don't know. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at X. Here we go. I'm going to share the screen real quick here about X. And we were asking about the publishing company, right? So I use AI occasionally, but I always have to at least know part of the answer so I know when it's kind of BSing me. But in this case, it goes into, okay, this is the Riverside Press, who owned it. So if you're doing deep dives into link analysis, kind of like what we did a little bit with the case of Home, you'll see that, okay, there's Henry Oscar Houghton. Look at his political side. You can look at who he's related to and that sort of thing. You can keep going down that road and see how does that go into helping or assisting the Bellamy projects, right? Who does he know? Does he know Supreme Court justices? Was Clarence Darrow in there? These fellow travelers, sometimes the links, the networks, the social circles are very, very, very important. And sometimes those social circles are big, but they only have a tenuous link onto them. And so looking at that, is it showing up? I just realized this may not be even showing in there. Hang on a second. Here we go. There we go. Now we can see it. Let me try to blow it up as much as I can. Okay, there we go. So now we have the screen back. Okay, so looking here, so I ask him about it. You can see that, okay, here's the basic information about it. But then I get down here to the motto and the logo. And it says it was a boy with a flute. And it goes into the boy with the flute. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, well, it's got a double flute, like a pan flute that's associated with Pan. And so I ask it, I said, what about the pan flute? And it says, no, it's not a pan flute, right? It says, so this is my question to it. I have the book in front of me. I'm looking at the picture itself. Grok, the AI, has told me, no. It's just a single flute. You don't know what you're talking about. Because I said, what does the symbolism of the pan character playing the double flute mean? And then luckily it did understand that it's in relation to the logo. And it says, no, it's not that. Right. And I'm like, well, hold on. So I sent him a picture and I'm like, look, here's the logo from the book. And it's definitely a double flute. Right. And he goes, oh, but it's funny because then he goes, well, yes, of course it's a double flute. And here's what it means. I'm like, but you literally just argued with me that it wasn't until it's proven it was. And then you change your mind 180. Oh, yes, absolutely. And you're talking as if you were the expert on it. So that gives you an example of, okay, there's still flaws within AI when you're doing historical research. So make sure you have your information prior to, because AI will lie to you and it will suddenly change its answer completely to look like it's the godlike knowledge of all repository, information. So keep that in mind. It will change its answer 100% from arguing that there's no way that that's a double flute. It's absolutely a boy and the single flute, and then when you show it, no, here's this, here's that. Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry. So for AI is not there yet. This was done literally right before the show. Looking on that because I wanted to get more information about the logo, about the company, and about the publishers of the Bellamy, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, that socialist pamphlet for the socialist guidebook for the smiley face socialism in the United States. So that was what we're looking at there. So that's the AI part. For papers, I did want to show you an example of the newspapers, which I absolutely found fascinating. So let me stop sharing this, go back over here. And again, I am not a video streamer, rely on people. Here we go. All right. So one of the things is with newspapers. So I'll show you a little bit of these. The newspapers are fascinating. This is really dense. I'll bring it up on screen here. But when I show people, we have a little class that we do to teach people this sort of thing. So we say, okay, here's this. Go with it. Run with these narratives. Let's figure out what's going on. There's even more stuff with Panama Canal in this, which connects because Teddy Roosevelt and McKinley, so the assassination, that determined Panama, right? If McKinley was in there, we'd have been in Nicaragua because he was still like, we're going Nicaragua. Teddy Roosevelt was kind of that wait and decider that moved the inertia so that we would change to Panama so that, well, JP Morgan and Rockefeller and the French get a lot more money. Anyway, so going here, just the density of the newspapers in the old days was phenomenal. They were records. They had so much information in there. I mean, births, deaths, everything. I cannot find, there's no death notices. And I'll tell you this. So I have to look up, this is a real life case a year ago. There was a daughter that wanted to look for her father who had been missing, and she believed he was homeless. Okay. So the first thing we do is we look at, okay, has he expired, right? So we check the death records. Here's your dad's name. This is his date of birth. You have this information. They've been estranged for like 21 years. And so we're looking him up. She says she believes the last time they communicated was, he was in this area. Um, but normally what we would do is you can look in a paper and you get the marriages, the births, and the deaths. It's great, right? You're able to get that. For the last 6 years, depending on some papers, and about 10 years in other papers, they don't do that anymore. Unless you pay them, they don't do that. They don't just out of hand print births, deaths, and marriages. You have to pay them to do that. So there's so much information that's lost, and it's supposed to go to the county, and then that's supposed to go to the state. But in some cases, some counties aren't equipped to handle it. They say, well, after 3 years, our records aren't there anymore. We give it to the state. The state says we don't have it, or we haven't archived it yet. And I went, oh man, really? So we are losing information. There is digital amnesia occurring. With the paper records, I have more information. I have more information about World War II than I have about the war I was in, which is the Gulf War, right? There's Iraqi freedom. I was in OIF 3 and then OIF, whatever the Iraqi thing in 2010, 11, or whatever the hell they were calling that. But there's less because it's on floppy disk that nobody can read anymore, and like Lotus notes that nobody sees anymore, right? And that's occurring even more rapidly. And AI is doing worse because it's covering that up. So I'm about to go on a rant here, but we'll wait for Michael Yon to come here and we'll do a rant on that. But digital amnesia, keep that in mind. There is literally a digital amnesia going in there. More information is in the past when it's written down than we have now available in the future. And I'm speaking as an investigator right now. There's more information about your personal habits because of your phone and spyware. But basic records that we can kind of look at and document, this is of record, that's gone, unfortunately. So keep that in mind. But I did want to show you this. Let me see if I can get there. So I showed you the AI. I showed you that for papers. Here we go. Here's another one. Now, this is an example. It's not a source document, but it's a copy of a source document. And this is the granular level you need to go into. So looking into Leon Czolgosz's, the anarchist that shot McKinley. Try not to just rely on authors and their interpretations of things, right? So in investigations, there's always the ABCs. A, assume nothing. B, believe no one, not even me, right? Because you're going to C, confirm everything, right? And I mean everything, right? So everything I'm telling you, go confirm it for yourself, right? Because I can make mistakes. I have biases. So keep that in mind as an investigator, be the ABCs of things, even in history. So what I like to do is always, even an author is pretty good author, like, oh, good grief. I'm trying to think the one I wanted to focus on for this one. But I've looked at it and he's made mistakes, right? So he's got some source documents that were off, especially with things like Asia and World War II. American authors and British are a little bit better, but Americans are just terrible with documents on that. I mean, there's Sarah Payne out there right now. Don't get me started. Terrible with that because their source documentation is just it's horrible on that. But I did want to show you this, and this is an interesting thing that I like to do. Go to the source documents for it. Again, we're going to share the screen here real quick, and I want to get to the McKinley assassination, but it was the here we go. Make sure the shares, and I'll have to do one more step to put it up on the screen. All right, here we go. Nice. Okay, so this is a transcript of the trial, which is very important. When you go and look at research and history, look for the trial transcripts. They should always be there, right? And you can look at a couple places. One is if it's municipal, sometimes municipal, but usually everything tends to go to in America. Everything tends to go to the state. The state archive will have a lot of things. There should be a state library where you are if you're watching from America. These are fantastic. Microfilm. Go learn how to do a microfilm because they're not digitizing everything. It's not even close. Learn how to do a microfilm. Physically go to your state library. Take a trip. You're gonna thank me for it, right? Trust me, it's gonna be amazing when you go there. And the archivists there, the librarians there, they're usually bored, right? So the state folks come in there and some high value researchers and some professors will go in there and their research assistants. But basically, the general public going in there saying, hey, I've got this cool history project, man, they're going to help you out like anything. They're going to show you how to do stuff. They're going to show you where the skeletons are buried, so to speak, in the archives. It's phenomenal. But the papers are there and the court records, maybe a law library, a state law library. So the state library should have a microfilm, every paper from the state. That's how I got the Devastator and the Agitator from home Washington, was you go to the state library in Olympia, Washington, and they had it on microfilm. They had two microfilms full, this little pamphlet. So I got to read in detail about the nudes versus the prudes, and about all of the troubles and things that Home Washington was doing, and from the perspective of that paper. Now, this one is the state. There should also be a law library, state law library. They will have a lot of the documents and the records, but sometimes you have to bounce around. Every state's different. Municipalities sometimes are different, but get the transcripts. You can do that. Everything that goes into court should be recorded and archived, so you can get the transcripts from it, and it's phenomenal. So this is, for example, is a copy of a transcript in New York for the People versus Leon Kolsgold, who had shot President McKinley. And you get the witnesses, you get his testimony, you get everything in there. And they did a pretty good job about transcribing it. But keep in mind that transcription sometimes will contain errors, but this one actually says these are some of the errors that it corrected, spelling and things like that. Because in the old days, it was a stenographer, either a stenographer or, the shorthand person that was doing it. But nowadays we have, different mechanisms. But back in the old days, it's phenomenal. They did what they could do with the technology they had. But this goes into it, and it's about the cross-examination. It's about, what is his network? Where did he get his ideas from? All of that goes into this, and it's phenomenal. So keep that in mind, as there's a lot that doesn't get written about in history, but that you might be interested in, and that may be relevant now when more facts come out. And so, again, looking at transcripts is a great way to go. Some of them are digitized, like this one, that you can find over here. And this guy from McKinleydeath.com has actually put it in there. It's kind of his, I'd use the word labor of love with an assassination, but he got all the source documents and basically put it in here for McKinley's assassination. But normally you would have to go to archives and get those transcripts for that, but you will find a lot of detail that you wouldn't. And for your link analysis, which is what this is about, Home Washington, the case of No Place Like Home, all of that, these things that tend to move people around this tiny little town in the middle of nowhere, Washington, is fascinating, because those links, and there's more links that occur from that. And you can really see how it's not just one person does something. Like Leon Kosgov, yes, he shot McKinley, which reverberated around the world, but he was influenced by thought processes. And that took a network, that took years to get him to that point. And then the assassination in Italy of Umberto by an anarchist, he says, that's it. But the kindling was already there. That's just the spark, right? The kindling, the conditions are set already in the mind of people to do these sorts of things. Sometimes there is a crime of passion or responsive, but generally it takes more. The bombers, the same thing. That's a long story about the radicalization of the labor movement, where it split, right? So there was definitely a split in there. And there was a lot going on. There was like a mini Civil War in America after the Civil War, with the labor movement within the United States in various forms. It's not one size paints all, but you can see when a group splits off, there's also a group that splits off from the federal government that basically used terrorism. So everybody was using terrorism at some point. And so how that kind of interacts and where that thought process is amazing, but you're going to find that kind of granular detail when you're looking for the evolution of ideas, the link analysis of the radicalization process. You can find it sometimes in those court transcripts. You can find it in the evidence of there, right? So even in the notes that don't make it in the transcript, the annexes that come in there, the evidence, the exhibits, all of this kind of works into it, which is absolutely important in doing your own due diligence on that. Because remember, the ABCs: assume nothing, believe no one, confirm everything. But there it is. So hopefully we've answered a lot of the case of Home Washington, and given you something to think about. Like I said, this is a core project that we do for a lot of the junior detectives, and how they can look in link analysis, where they can find answers, and do those sorts of things. The other one I like is the maps. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. So if you go back to the Detective Club 2 weeks ago, we show you online maps, how you can take an old map or an old drawing, and it'll actually go on the modern geosatellite maps, so you can figure out where something was at what time. And you're able to kind of walk the ground, which is another important part of this. Sometimes you have to go to the ground to kind of look at it and validate things, and you'll see things that's surprising, especially in battlefields and things like that. We call them staff rides, but there it is. All right, we are good for the day, actually, unless there's any questions. Next week, we're going to try to get on. We might get Mike Ligon on again, or there's a couple of people were asking me to bring on from that one. One of which is actually a pretty good one. She's actually a refugee from the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and she has written about the history of the real history of the CCP, which is a big thing that I like to focus on. So I'm going to check the questions here real quick, and if not, we will call this a day. We thank you all for coming in for the live one. We may do this again. We'll open it up for everybody instead of just the paid members, but the paid members, we're still going to do some more behind the scenes things on it. I'll probably make a video just on this, and then we should be good. And I think we're good. All right, no questions. Going once. Going twice. All right. Well, we'll post it, and if anything's in there in the comments, post your questions in the comments, and we'll go from there. So thank you, everybody. You guys have a safe weekend, and keep studying history. Thank you very much again. If you're interested in more, if there's any questions on any historical one that you want us to look into, let me know. If you're in Washington State and want to be a private investigator, let me know. I can train you on that now. So I'm licensed to go through that. If you're curious about investigations, let me know. For private, also some government investigations, if you're interested in that, I can at least turn you into the right area. But always, history is a phenomenal test bed to use those same techniques that you use in real world investigations. You can use in history, and it's really good. It's good for kids too. So that's why we teach Think Like a Detective, because a lot of children nowadays, we've had a lot of moms come up to us going, "Hey, our kids just, they're there," and some investigators that come in that are young, straight from the courses, they don't have real world investigation experience. They think different, and we have to reset their mind. So we have a course. We're probably going to move it online too, for Think Like a Detective, and it recalibrates your mind so that you have an evidence-based approach, a rational-based approach. You mitigate your biases. You can never eliminate them, and some techniques and tips about how to process to investigate anything. So we use history because it's pretty good. There's some true crime that we put in there, depending on the age group. We may include those, and we don't. But if it's mostly in adults, we'll do some true crime in there so you can kind of get your feet wet in some of those early cases, which are fascinating. And at the end of it, you'll be able to have good, as Michael says, thinking hygiene. So you can look through there and basically have an evidence-based approach in how you're able to do investigations of history and even current events, whatever's going on around you. It's very helpful. I mean, to me, it's been very helpful. And everybody that's gone through the course, so far, it's been positive feedback. I've never had somebody come back and go, "You ruined my life." So that's my litmus test. As long as nobody's shooting at me, I guess they're happy with me. So we'll keep it there. Again, thank you very much, and have a great day.